He thought he had seen it all, until he adopted an 8-year-old boy and found in him traces of the son he lost 30 years ago. Each clue discovered transforms the mystery into a nightmare with no logical explanation. The answer isn't in coincidences, but in secret experiments that challenge the limits of science, and at the center of everything, an inescapable truth. The child he swore to protect may not be who he thinks he is. If this story interests you, subscribe to our channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing. The double penthouse. On the top floor of the tallest building in New York City offered a panoramic view of the city, but Theodore Morgan no longer appreciated it. At 65, the financial market magnate contemplated the gray horizon with the same empty gaze that had become his trademark over the past 3 decades. What economic journals called the calculated coldness of a business genius was, in fact, the gaze of a man devastated by the greatest loss anyone could suffer. "The numbers don't look good, Theodore," said Martha Davis, his executive assistant, as she slid a folder across the black marble desk. "Morgan Investments shares have fallen 12% just this week." Theodore didn't respond immediately. His fingers, still firm despite his age, drummed on the arm of his Italian leather armchair. "Have the vultures started circling?" he finally asked, without taking his eyes off the window. "The press is having a field day. The scandal with the subsidiary in Florida is in all the headlines. They're questioning whether you knew about the embezzlement to offshore accounts." A bitter smile formed on Theodore's lips. 30 years building an empire to be destroyed by incompetence. He finally turned to face Martha. "And where is Richard at this moment? My dear partner should be here facing this hell with me." He cancelled the meeting. Said he's resolving the situation with investors in Dubai. Theodore knew it was a lie. Richard Albertson, his partner of 20 years, was strategically distancing himself from the scandal. That's how the business world worked. When the ship started to sink, the rats were the first to abandon it. Theodore's cell phone vibrated. It was Claudia, his public relations manager, probably with more disastrous news about the company's image. He ignored the call and stood up, heading to the private bar hidden behind a panel of fine wood. "You need a strategy, Theodore," Martha insisted, adjusting her thin-framed glasses. "Something that shows the public you're not the monster they're painting you as. Some action that humanizes your image." Theodore poured himself whiskey, watching the amber liquid swirl in the crystal glass. "Humanize," he laughed, a sound without joy. "Do you really think they want to see the human in me, Martha? What they want is blood. They want to see the powerful Theodore Morgan on his knees." "Then give them something different to look at," she replied, with the determination of someone who had known him long enough to speak bluntly. "Something that makes them question the narrative they're building." Theodore took a long sip and contemplated his assistant's words. It wasn't the first crisis he had faced, but it was perhaps the most serious. The truth was that at 65, with a fortune he couldn't spend in 3 lifetimes, Theodore was tired. The emptiness he felt wasn't just the result of the financial scandal. It was an abyss that had been growing inside him since that fateful Sunday morning 30 years ago, when Matthew, his only son, disappeared without a trace. Theodore's office was a sanctuary of power, but hidden in the lowest drawer of his desk, locked with a key he always carried with him, was a photo album. It was his secret, his weakness, something he would never show anyone. There were the records of moments with Matthew and Beatrice, his ex-wife, a family that briefly existed and was shattered in the worst possible way. "Philanthropy," said Martha, interrupting his thoughts. "You need to do something meaningful, something no one expects from you." Theodore returned to the desk and opened the folder with the financial reports, but his mind was already wandering far from there. "Call the New Tomorrow Institute," he ordered suddenly. "The one that takes care of orphaned and abandoned children. I want to make a visit." Martha's surprised look lasted only a second before she resumed her professional posture. "I'll schedule it for tomorrow." "No, this afternoon, and no press, no photographers. I want it to be discreet." When Martha left to organize the visit, Theodore opened the locked drawer and took out the photo album. The worn leather cover betrayed the years those memories had remained stored, rarely visited. On the first page was Matthew at 8 years old, smiling at the camera with his arm in a cast after a bicycle fall. That half-moon-shaped scar would have remained on his left arm, just below the elbow. The New Tomorrow Institute was located in the outskirts of New York City, in a renovated old mansion that housed about 40 children. Theodore dismissed his driver and asked Martha to wait in the car. He wanted to do this alone. The director of the institute, Dr. Helen Williamson, a middle-aged woman with a serene appearance and calculated gestures, didn't hide her surprise at receiving one of the richest men in America at her institution. "Mr. Morgan, I confess I'm perplexed by your visit," she said, leading him down the hallway decorated with children's drawings, "especially without any prior notice from your staff." "I prefer spontaneity in certain matters, Dr. Helen," replied Theodore, observing the environment attentively. The place was simple but clean and organized. The voices of children echoed from a nearby courtyard. "And what brings you to our humble institute?" she asked, with a look that mixed curiosity and suspicion. "I'm considering making a significant contribution," he replied, keeping his voice neutral. "But first, I'd like to know about the work you do." Helen smiled, that kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Of course, I'd be happy to show you our facilities and explain our programs. We focus on family reintegration when possible, and preparation for adoption in other cases." As they walked through the various areas of the institute, Theodore observed the children with an interest that surprised even himself. There was something in those small faces that touched him in a way he hadn't felt in years. The innocence, perhaps, or the possibility of a new beginning that each of those lives represented. It was in the inner courtyard during snack time that Theodore saw him for the first time. A boy of approximately 8 years old, sitting alone on a bench, reading a book while the other children played. There was something in the boy's posture, in the way he slightly furrowed his brow as he turned the pages, that immediately captured Theodore's attention. "Who is that boy?" he asked, interrupting the director's explanation about the educational system they implemented. Helen followed his gaze and her expression subtly changed. "That's Gabriel. He's been with us for only 6 months. A special case." "Special how?" "Well, he was found wandering alone at the Port Authority bus terminal. He had no documents, nor could he give his full name or where he came from. The police brought him to us while they investigated, but they never found any relatives." Theodore watched the boy turn a page in his book. His movements were deliberate, almost adult in their precision. And his memory? He doesn't remember anything from his past. Only fragments. The psychologists believe it's a case of severe trauma, possibly caused by some extreme situation that his brain chose to block. Something in the boy's story awakened a deep interest in Theodore, more than he could rationally explain. "Has he been through adoption attempts?" Helen hesitated before answering. "We've had 2 interested couples, but there were complications. Gabriel has episodes of unusual behavior. Sometimes he says things that don't make sense, as if he had lived experiences that would be impossible for someone his age." At that moment, as if he felt he was being observed, Gabriel looked up from his book and his gaze met Theodore's. It was a brief but intense moment. The boy tilted his head slightly, as if trying to recognize something familiar in the older man's face. It was then that Gabriel raised his arm to brush the hair from his face, and his shirt sleeve slipped, revealing a mark on his left arm, a half-moon-shaped scar just below the elbow. The world around Theodore seemed to slow down. The voices of the children became distant. Dr. Helen's comment sounded muffled. All he could see was that mark, identical to the one his son Matthew had carried 3 decades ago. "Mr. Morgan, are you feeling all right?" The director's voice finally penetrated his consciousness. Theodore took a deep breath, regaining his composure. "Yes, just a moment of distraction." He turned to Helen, with a decision already formed. "Dr. Helen, I'd like to discuss the possibility of adoption." The director's look of surprise was momentary but revealing. "Adoption? You're considering adopting a child?" "Not just any child. replied Theodore, looking back at the solitary boy. "I'm interested in Gabriel." The adoption process advanced with unusual speed, driven by Theodore's influence and generous donations to the New Tomorrow Institute. Even so, Dr. Helen Williamson didn't fail to express her concerns during the last meeting before the official transfer of custody. "Mr. Morgan, I understand your enthusiasm, but adoption isn't like a business transaction," she said, organizing a folder with Gabriel's documents, "especially in the case of this boy who presents peculiarities." Theodore was looking through the director's office window. In the outer courtyard, Gabriel was playing with a complex puzzle, assembling it with unusual concentration for a child his age. "I believe I can offer everything he needs," he replied, without taking his eyes off the boy. "Stability, quality education, and a home." "I don't question your material resources, Mr. Morgan," Helen approached, also observing Gabriel. "But raising a child, especially one with Gabriel's background, requires much more than money. It requires time, patience, emotional availability." Theodore turned to face her with a look that didn't admit contestation. "I'm prepared, Dr. Helen, and I should remind you that I've raised a son before." The mention of Theodore's missing son made Helen step back slightly. "Yes, of course. I'm just fulfilling my duty to ensure the best for the children under my responsibility." After some final formalities, Helen handed Theodore a thin folder with medical and psychological information about Gabriel. "These are all the records we have of him since he arrived at the Institute. As I mentioned, he appeared without documentation. So much of his previous history is unknown." Theodore quickly leafed through the documents, noting the scarcity of concrete information about the boy's origin. "What about the scar on his arm? Is there any explanation of how he got it?" Helen hesitated, as if measuring her words. "Gabriel doesn't remember how he got it. According to our doctor, it appears to be an old scar, possibly from an accident that occurred years ago." The magnate nodded, storing this information. The coincidence of the mark identical to that of his missing son was too disturbing to ignore, but he knew he needed to be cautious with his theories, at least for now. The next morning, a sunny Friday, Theodore personally picked up Gabriel. The boy carried only a small backpack with his few belongings, some donated clothes, 2 books already worn from use, and a drawing notebook. On the journey to the mansion in the Upper East Side, an upscale neighborhood in New York City, Theodore tried to establish a conversation with Gabriel, who remained quiet, observing the city through the car window. "Do you like music, Gabriel?" he asked, breaking the silence. The boy turned slowly, as if he needed to process the question. "I like piano," he answered with a soft voice, but surprisingly articulate for his age. "I know how to play." Theodore raised his eyebrows, surprised. "Really? Where did you learn?" Gabriel frowned, as if trying to access a distant memory. "I don't know. I think someone taught me, a long time ago. Well, I have a piano at home. Maybe you can show me what you can do." The boy nodded and went back to looking out the window. Theodore noticed how he observed everything with unusual intensity, recording every detail of the journey. It wasn't typical behavior for an 8-year-old child. The Morgan mansion, with its 3 floors of neoclassical architecture and meticulously maintained gardens, would impress anyone. However, when the car parked in the circular driveway of the property, Gabriel merely observed the building with a neutral expression, almost as if he already knew it. "This is where you'll live now," said Theodore as an employee opened the car door. "I know," replied Gabriel, getting out of the vehicle. That apparently simple answer made Theodore pause for a moment. "What do you mean, you know?" The boy shrugged. "It seems familiar." Inside, the mansion. Theodore introduced Gabriel to the small staff. Mrs. Jenkins, the housekeeper who had worked for him for more than 20 years, Augustus, the discreet and efficient butler, and Selina, the cook, whose culinary skills were one of the few pleasures that Theodore still genuinely appreciated. "The boy's room is ready, sir, as you requested," Mrs. Jenkins informed, observing Gabriel with maternal curiosity. "It's in the east corridor next to the library." "Thank you, Jenkins. I'll take him personally." As they climbed the wide staircase that led to the second floor, Gabriel suddenly stopped, looking at one of the side corridors. "Your room is over there," he said, pointing to the west corridor, "at the end with the double doors." A chill ran down Theodore's spine. He had never shown the boy the floor plan of the house, much less mentioned the location of his room. "How do you know that, Gabriel?" The boy blinked a few times, seeming confused by his own statement. "I don't know, I just know." The room prepared for Gabriel was spacious and bright, decorated with neutral colors and furniture suitable for a child. There was a bookshelf with carefully selected children's books, a study desk, and an area for toys, although Theodore didn't know exactly what the boy liked. "This is your new space," he said, observing the boy's reaction. "We can modify it according to your preferences." Gabriel walked slowly around the room, touching the objects with disturbing familiarity. When he reached the window, he stood looking at the gardens for a long moment. "There was a swing on that tree," he murmured, pointing to a centuries-old maple. Theodore felt his heart accelerate. Indeed, 30 years ago, there had been a swing on that same tree, Matthew's favorite. It had been removed years later, when Theodore could no longer bear to look at the object that brought him so many painful memories. "How can you know that?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Gabriel turned, his dark eyes meeting Theodore's. "I dream about this place," he answered simply. "I dream about you too. It's as if—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's as if I've been here before." That night, after Gabriel fell asleep, Theodore retired to his private office on the third floor of the mansion. It was there that he spent most of his sleepless nights, working or simply drinking while confronting his own demons. Martha appeared shortly after, bringing the daily reports on the company's situation, which was still in crisis. But Theodore could barely concentrate on the numbers. "Something is bothering you besides the business crisis," observed Martha, noting his distant state. "Is it about the boy?" Theodore poured himself a generous dose of whiskey. "There's something strange about him, Martha. Something I can't explain." "Strange how?" "He knows things. Things about this house, about me, that he couldn't possibly know." Theodore hesitated, aware of how what he would say next would sound. "And that mark on his arm, it's identical to the one Matthew had." Martha adjusted her glasses, a gesture she made when she was uncomfortable. "Theodore, I know your son's loss was traumatic, but don't you think you might be projecting?" "It's not just that." He put the glass on the table with excessive force. "I want to know more about this boy's past. The Institute's records are too superficial." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Theodore contemplated the question for a moment. "I want a DNA test. I want to compare his genetic material with mine." Martha stared at him with evident concern. "Theodore, this is madness. Your son would be almost 40 today. This boy is 8. "I'm aware of the impossibility, Martha." He took a deep breath, trying to order his thoughts. "But there's something that doesn't fit in this whole story, and I want to find out what it is." The next morning, without anyone's knowledge except Martha's, Theodore hired a private laboratory to discreetly collect Gabriel's genetic material. A nurse appeared at the mansion with the excuse of conducting routine tests on the boy as part of the post-adoption process. While waiting for the results, Theodore dedicated himself to getting to know Gabriel better. Surprisingly, the boy adapted quickly to his new life. In a few days, he already knew every corner of the mansion, as if he had lived there for years. One afternoon, Theodore found Gabriel in the music room, sitting at the grand piano that hadn't been played in decades. With impressive skill, the boy was performing a complex piece by Chopin. "Who taught you to play like that?" asked Theodore, astonished. Gabriel stopped, seeming embarrassed at being discovered. "I don't know. My fingers just remember." It was another piece of an increasingly intriguing puzzle. The same piano had been the favorite instrument of Beatrice, Theodore's ex-wife and Matthew's mother. She used to play Chopin on rainy afternoons, with little Matthew sitting by her side. A few days later, the sealed envelope with the test results arrived. Theodore waited until he was alone in his office to open it. His hands trembled slightly as he tore the seal and removed the report. What he read on the following pages made his blood freeze. The test had found a partial match between Theodore's and Gabriel's DNA, enough to indicate kinship, but with inexplicable anomalies in the boy's genetic structure. The report mentioned significant inconsistencies that deviated from the normal pattern of human heredity. Perplexed, Theodore immediately called the laboratory director, demanding explanations. "Dr. Carter, what does this mean? How can there be a partial match with these anomalies you mention?" The voice on the other end of the line sounded hesitant. "Mr. Morgan, to be frank, we've never seen anything like it. We would need more tests to fully understand what's happening. Do whatever is necessary. Money is not an issue." "There's one more thing, Mr. Morgan. We compared the collected material with the national database and found a partial match with an old case, a disappearance that occurred approximately 30 years ago." Theodore felt the air leave his lungs. "Which case?" "According to the system, the case of Matthew Morgan, your son." That night, Theodore couldn't sleep. The implications of the test results were too disturbing. How could Gabriel have DNA compatible with Matthew's? It was biologically impossible. Unless his stream of thoughts was interrupted by a scream coming from Gabriel's room. Theodore ran down the hallway, finding the boy sitting in bed, trembling, his face bathed in tears. "Nightmare?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Gabriel shook his head. "Memories. She's going to come get me." "Who's going to come get you, Gabriel?" The boy looked at Theodore with eyes taken by fear. "The woman in white. She never sleeps. She always finds me." Theodore placed his hand on the boy's shoulder to comfort him and noticed that the scar on his arm seemed more pronounced, almost bright against the pale skin. "No one is going to take you from here," assured Theodore. "You're safe now." Gabriel seemed to calm down a bit, but his next words sent another wave of shock through Theodore. "You said that before, Dad, but they took me anyway." The word "Dad" echoed in Theodore's mind as he walked through the silent corridors of the mansion in the early hours of the following morning. Gabriel had fallen asleep again after the nocturnal episode, but Theodore remained alert, restless with the implications of what he was discovering. Sitting in his office, with only the desk lamp illuminating the darkness, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he rarely used. "Ferguson, it's Theodore Morgan. I know it's late, but I need your services urgently." He paused, listening to the sleepy response on the other end. "Yes, it's a sensitive matter. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., at the usual place." John Ferguson was a former detective who had been working as a private investigator for more than 20 years. It had been he who led the search for Matthew when the boy disappeared. And even after the case was officially closed, due to lack of evidence, Ferguson never stopped looking for clues, driven both by professional commitment and by the friendship he had developed with Theodore during those dark times. The next morning, while Gabriel was involved in a session with a private tutor hired by Theodore, the businessman met with Ferguson at a discreet cafe in Brooklyn. "I never thought you would call me to reopen this specific case," commented Ferguson, a man in his early 60s with a face marked by time and a scar that cut across his left eyebrow. "I thought you had accepted the outcome." Theodore pushed a brown envelope across the table. "It's not exactly a reopening. It's something different. I need you to investigate this institute new tomorrow, and especially the director, Helen Williamson. I want to know everything. Where she's been for the last 20 years, who she worked with, anything suspicious." Ferguson opened the envelope and examined the preliminary information that Theodore had gathered. "What exactly do you suspect?" Theodore hesitated. How to explain his theories without sounding like a lunatic? "I've adopted a boy from this institute. There are disturbing coincidences related to Matthew." The investigator studied Theodore's face for a moment, then nodded. "I understand. I'll start immediately. As for the methods, use whatever is necessary. Absolute discretion, but spare no resources." While Ferguson began his investigation, Theodore intensified his effort to understand Gabriel. He hired the best specialists in child development and neurologists, disguising the consultations as routine checkups so as not to alarm the boy. Dr. Olivia Price, a renowned neuropediatrician, was the first to express perplexity after examining Gabriel. "Mr. Morgan, this boy's cognitive abilities are extraordinary," she commented after a long testing session. "His mathematical processing, memory, and linguistic capacity are far beyond what's expected for his chronological age." "Does this suggest some kind of special condition?" asked Theodore, careful not to reveal his true concerns. The doctor hesitated. "The most intriguing thing is the discrepancy between his abilities. Some areas function like those of an educated adult, while others seem perfectly aligned with the age of 8. It's as if—" She interrupted herself, searching for words. "It's as if different parts of his brain had different ages." The doctor's words only reinforced the increasingly disturbing theories that Theodore had been formulating. 2 weeks after the beginning of the investigations, an unexpected incident accelerated events. Theodore was informed that the laboratory, where he conducted the DNA test, had suffered a mysterious fire, destroying equipment and part of the collection of samples. Coincidentally, the fire started exactly in the section where Gabriel's tests had been processed. The next day, Ferguson appeared at the mansion without warning, visibly agitated. "We need to talk in private," he insisted, refusing even the drink offered by Mrs. Jenkins. In the office, with the doors locked and certainty that they would not be overheard, Ferguson poured out his findings. "Theodore, there's something very wrong with this institute." He opened a folder with photos and documents. "Dr. Helen Williamson is not who she claims to be. In fact, until 5 years ago, there's practically no record of her in the United States." "What do you mean?" "It's as if she appeared out of nowhere. Her medical degree comes from a university in Switzerland, but when I checked with my European contacts, I discovered glaring inconsistencies." Ferguson passed some photos to Theodore. "This is her 2 years ago participating in a scientific congress in Geneva, not as a social worker or pediatrician, but as a genetic researcher linked to the Aurora Institute." Theodore examined the photograph. It was unmistakably Helen, albeit with shorter hair and a more severe posture, conversing with other scientists in front of a banner of the so-called Aurora Institute. "And what is this Aurora Institute?" "A biomedical research center officially focused on longevity and cellular rejuvenation, funded by an international foundation called New Horizon." Ferguson made a significant pause. "Guess who is the main benefactor of this foundation?" Before Theodore could respond, the investigator slid another photograph across the table. In it, an elegant middle-aged woman was cutting an inauguration ribbon. "Beatrice Ashton Morgan, your ex-wife." The impact of the revelation hit Theodore like a physical blow. He hadn't seen or spoken to Beatrice in almost 3 decades, since Matthew's disappearance destroyed the marriage. After the divorce, she had left the United States, supposedly to rebuild her life away from the painful memories. This doesn't make sense. Beatrice hated science. She was a pianist, gave music lessons. People change, especially after traumas. Ferguson picked up another document. There's more. The New Tomorrow Institute receives indirect funding from the same foundation, and in the last 5 years, at least 7 children have passed through there with suspiciously similar backgrounds to Gabriel's. Sudden appearance, no documentation, advanced cognitive abilities, and all with the same mark on their arm. Theodore felt his heart racing. And where are these children now? That's the problem. They were all adopted by influential families in different countries. But when I tried to track them, Ferguson shook his head. I found obstacles in all directions. It's as if someone were systematically erasing the traces. At that moment, Theodore understood that he had stumbled upon something much bigger and more sinister than he had imagined. "We need protection for Gabriel," he said, rising abruptly. "I'm going to transfer him to a safe place until we fully understand what's happening." "There's one more thing you need to know," interrupted Ferguson, with a somber expression. "My contact in the FBI informed me that Helen Williamson left the United States last night, bound for Geneva. And before departing, she had a 2-hour meeting with Richard Albertson, my partner. The revelation was disconcerting. Richard had no connection to the world of philanthropy or adoption. Exactly. And half an hour after that meeting, he made a transfer of $5 million to an account in Liechtenstein, belonging to the New Horizon Foundation. The implications were alarming. If Richard was involved, it meant that the situation was even more complex and potentially dangerous than Theodore had imagined. Upon returning to the main room, they found Gabriel sitting on the sofa, calmly drawing in his notebook. Seeing Theodore, the boy smiled, but his gaze caught Ferguson's presence and his expression subtly changed. "Gabriel, this is a friend of mine, Mr. Ferguson," introduced Theodore. The boy studied the investigator with unusual intensity. "You were looking for me before," said Gabriel, surprising both men. "A long time ago." Ferguson cast a questioning look at Theodore, who merely made a discreet gesture asking for patience. "How do you know that, Gabriel?" asked the investigator, approaching cautiously. "I saw your face in her files." The boy returned to his drawing, apparently uninterested in his own bombshell revelation. "The woman in white said you were dangerous because you never gave up." Ferguson paled. 30 years ago, during the investigation of Matthew's disappearance, he had pursued a lead related to an unknown woman seen in the vicinity of the Morgan mansion days before the incident. In the notes of that investigation, which never became public, he had informally described her as the woman in white, due to the outfit she wore in the security images. "Gabriel, could you show me what you're drawing?" asked Theodore, trying to keep his voice calm despite the tension. The boy turned the notebook. On the paper, he had drawn with impressive detail what appeared to be an underground facility with laboratories, medical equipment, and several interconnected capsules. In the center of the image, a large transparent capsule contained what seemed to be a sleeping person. "It's where they keep the time," explained Gabriel with disturbing naturalness. "It's where she's going to take me back to." The next morning, following Ferguson's advice, Theodore was preparing to take Gabriel to an isolated property in upstate New York, where it would be easier to protect him while they continued the investigation. However, before they could depart, Martha arrived at the mansion with alarming news. "Theodore, we have a serious problem," she announced, visibly shaken. "I received a call from the board of directors. They're calling an extraordinary meeting to vote on your removal from the presidency. Who's behind this? Richard, obviously. He's claiming that your mental health is compromised, that you've been acting erratically and putting the company's interests at risk." Theodore smiled bitterly. "Very convenient, isn't it? Just when we're discovering his connection to all this." "There's more," continued Martha. "He's using your sudden adoption of Gabriel as proof of unstable behavior. And," she hesitated, "he has filed a petition with family court to revoke the adoption, claiming that you are not psychologically fit to care for a child." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Richard was clearly trying to isolate Theodore and, more importantly, gain access to Gabriel. "When is the meeting?" asked Theodore, already calculating his options. "Tomorrow at 10 a.m. If you don't show up, it will be interpreted as confirmation of the accusations." While they discussed strategies, the phone rang. Mrs. Jenkins answered, and moments later entered the room with a concerned expression. "Mr. Theodore, it's the building reception. They say there's a woman insisting on seeing you, claiming it's urgent. She refuses to identify herself, but says it's about the boy." Theodore and Ferguson exchanged tense looks. "What does she look like?" asked the investigator. "According to the doorman, an elegant lady, around 60 years old." Theodore's heart stopped for an instant. "Ask them to let her come up," he decided after a moment. "But first, Martha, take Gabriel to his room and stay with him. Don't leave him alone for any reason." Minutes later, the private elevator to the penthouse opened its doors, revealing a figure that Theodore hadn't seen in almost 30 years. Beatrice Ashton Morgan had aged with elegance. Her hair, once black, was now completely white, cut in a precise bob that framed a still beautiful face, marked by expression lines. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored white suit, the woman in white that Gabriel feared. "Hello, Theodore," she said, with the voice he had never forgotten. "I see we finally meet again, and in such peculiar circumstances. Beatrice, Theodore struggled to maintain his composure with superhuman effort. "I think you have a lot to explain." She smiled, a smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. "On the contrary, I came to warn you. You have no idea what you've triggered by bringing that boy to this house." "I'm beginning to understand," replied Theodore, indicating with a gesture that she could sit down. "And I believe you are the central piece of this puzzle." Beatrice observed the room slowly, her gaze lingering on the old photographs, the familiar objects. "You kept everything practically the same." Her tone was almost accusatory. "Stuck in the past, as always. Unlike you, who apparently rebuilt your life as, what exactly? Philanthropist? Scientist? Child kidnapper?" Beatrice's gaze hardened. "You were always so limited in your vision, Theodore, always thinking inside conventional boxes. That's why you never understood what really happened to Matthew, or what's happening now." "Then explain it to me," he challenged, containing the anger that simmered beneath his apparent calm. Beatrice looked at Ferguson, who remained silent in a corner of the room. "This is not a matter for external ears. What you can say in front of him, you can say in front of me," intervened Ferguson. "I've been seeking answers about Matthew for 30 years. A sigh of irritation escaped Beatrice's lips. "Very well. But don't say I didn't warn you." She turned to Theodore. "I came because I received information that you conducted genetic tests on the boy, tests that produced unusual results." "How did you know about that?" "I have my resources. The important thing is that you're meddling with forces you don't understand, Theodore. That boy is not what you think." "And what exactly is he, Beatrice?" Theodore leaned forward. "Is he our son? Is he Matthew?" A strange gleam passed through Beatrice's eyes. "Yes and no. The answer is more complex than your limited mind can process." At that moment, a sound from the hallway caught everyone's attention. Gabriel was standing at the door, having escaped Martha's vigilance. His eyes met Beatrice's, and the reaction was immediate. The boy paled, stepping back. "You came to take me back," he whispered with a trembling voice. "To the capsule room." Beatrice rose slowly, facing the boy with an indescribable expression, a mixture of perverse triumph and tenderness. "Hello, G7, she said, using a term that no one in the room understood. "Or would you prefer that I call you Matthew, after... Well, technically, both names are yours." Time seemed to freeze in that room. Theodore suddenly felt dizzy, as if the floor beneath his feet had become unstable. G7, Matthew. Beatrice's words echoed in his mind as he looked from Gabriel's pale face to his ex-wife's calculating expression. "What have you done, Beatrice?" Theodore's voice came out as a hoarse whisper, laden with decades of pain, and now a new nascent horror. Gabriel was visibly trembling, his eyes fixed on Beatrice like a cornered animal facing a predator. When Martha appeared breathless in the hallway, having noticed the boy's disappearance, Theodore made a silent gesture for her to approach and stay with Gabriel. "Come here, sweetheart," called Martha, extending her hand to the boy, who ran to her side seeking protection. Beatrice observed the scene with clinical detachment. He was always very attached to substitute maternal figures, a recurring pattern in all cycles. "Cycles?" questioned Ferguson, breaking his own silence. "What exactly are we talking about here, ma'am?" Beatrice sat down again, adjusting her posture as if preparing for a formal lecture. "Programmed cellular regeneration and selective mnemonic transfer," she replied, as if citing the title of a scientific article, or in simpler terms for lay minds, controlled rejuvenation. Theodore stepped toward her, struggling to maintain his composure. "I'm tired of your games, Beatrice. Answer clearly. Is that boy Matthew?" She held his gaze coldly. "Genetically? Yes, in essence. Biologically? It's complicated. Chronologically, absolutely not." She made a calculated pause. "Is consciousness continuous or interrupted when we recycle the body that houses it? It's a fascinating philosophical question, don't you think?" "For God's sake, Beatrice," exploded Theodore. "What did you do to our son?" "What did I do?" Her voice took on a defensive tone. I saved him, Theodore. Saved him from humanity's greatest weakness, time. Ferguson approached cautiously, his investigative instinct sharpened by decades of experience, detecting truth among elaborate lies. Are you saying you found a way to reverse aging, to restart a person? A smile of satisfaction crossed Beatrice's face. Finally, someone asking the right questions. She looked at Theodore with disdain. See? Even your watchdog understands faster than you. Answer the question, insisted Theodore, his patience exhausted. I didn't find a way. I created it. The pride in her voice was palpable. When Matthew disappeared, you immersed yourself in your fortune and power. I immersed myself in science. You were looking for a person. I was looking for a solution. As Beatrice spoke, Theodore noticed Gabriel whispering something to Martha, who listened with an increasingly alarmed expression. What are we doing here? Inquired Beatrice, opening her arms in an encompassing gesture. Aging, deteriorating, walking toward oblivion. I refuse to accept that reality, especially after Matthew was diagnosed. This revelation caught Theodore by surprise. Diagnosed? What are you talking about? Beatrice's gaze registered triumph upon realizing that there was information he didn't know. You didn't know? Of course not. You were too busy building your financial empire. Her tone distilled bitterness. 3 months before the disappearance, Matthew was diagnosed with a rare degenerative neurological condition. Terminal. The doctors gave him 2 years to live at most. The impact of the revelation was devastating. All those years, Theodore had imagined his son kidnapped, suffering at the hands of criminals or worse. He had never considered the possibility of a hidden disease. Why did you never tell me? He asked, his voice trembling with contained emotion. Because you would react exactly as you are reacting now, with emotional fragility. Beatrice shook, her head in apparent disappointment. I needed solutions, not tears. So you took him, concluded Ferguson, putting the pieces together. It wasn't a kidnapping by strangers, it was you. Took is such a judgment-laden word. Beatrice adjusted the sleeve of her white blazer. I saved him. I found scientists in Europe who were secretly working with experimental regeneration therapies. Techniques that the ethical world would condemn, but which offered the only hope for Matthew. Theodore felt his blood boil in his veins. You experimented on our son, without my knowledge or consent. And I achieved the impossible. Beatrice's voice rose, inflamed by her own conviction. The first treatment reversed the disease. The second halted cellular aging. And the third... She looked at Gabriel, who shrank behind Martha. The third achieved something humanity has always dreamed of. True rejuvenation, complete regeneration of the body to a previous state, maintaining selected aspects of memory and personality. The silence that followed was dense, almost suffocating. The magnitude of what Beatrice was describing was difficult to process, not only because of its scientific implication, but because of the underlying moral horror. How many times? Asked Theodore finally, his voice little more than a whisper. Beatrice seemed confused. What do you mean? How many times did you rejuvenate our son? Each word was pronounced with effort, as if each syllable caused physical pain. She hesitated. For the first time, her gaze momentarily shifting to Gabriel. This is the 7th cycle, hence the code G7. 7 lives, 30 years. The horror of understanding hit Theodore in successive waves. Matthew had been used as a guinea pig in continuous experiments for 3 decades, his body repeatedly rejuvenated, his memories manipulated, his very identity fragmented and reconstructed, according to the whims of his mother and her scientific collaborators. You are a monster, Theodore declared, with a calmness that masked the inner storm. I am a visionary, corrected Beatrice. And I'm not alone. There are powerful people who understand the importance of our work, people who fund our research because they know we are reshaping humanity's future. Like Richard? Asked Theodore, remembering the $1 million transfer mentioned by Ferguson. Richard is just a pawn, Useful for now, disposable the next moment. Beatrice stood adjusting her designer bag on her shoulder. I came here because, unlike what you might think, I'm not cruel. I wanted to warn you, give you the chance to say goodbye properly this time. Say goodbye? Theodore felt a chill. G7 needs to return to the program. This cycle is coming to an end, and we need to document the results before starting the next one. She took a few steps toward Gabriel, who instinctively backed away. You won't feel pain, dear, you never do. You're not taking him anywhere, declared Theodore, positioning himself between Beatrice and the boy. This nightmare ends now. Beatrice smiled condescendingly. You were always so predictable, Theodore. Do you really think I would come alone without guarantees? She consulted her wristwatch. At this very moment, a team from Child Protective Services is on its way, with an emergency court order to remove the boy from your custody based on psychiatric reports detailing your recent erratic behavior and possible mental instability. Forged. Her reports, accused Ferguson. Reports signed by 3 respected specialists, corrected Beatrice. Who will the judge believe? Credentialed professionals or a former detective hired by the accused? The plan was impeccable in its perversity. Theodore was being cornered from all sides. The company being ripped from his hands, his sanity questioned, and now Gabriel, or Matthew, or whoever the boy really was, about to be taken to continue. As an object of inhuman experiments, at this critical moment, it was Gabriel who surprised everyone. Coming out from behind Martha, he advanced and stood face to face with Beatrice, his childish eyes carrying a disturbing intensity. I remember everything now, he declared, with a voice that sounded strangely mature for his child's body. I remember the laboratory in Geneva, the capsules, the other children. Beatrice paled slightly. Impossible. The memories between cycles are carefully filtered. Not everything can be erased. Gabriel pointed to the scar on his arm. You said this was my anchor point, the mark that connects all cycles, but it's not just the scar that persists, it's the memories linked to it. Beatrice's confidence seemed to waver momentarily, but she soon regained her composure. Fascinating. One more piece of data for our research. She consulted her watch again. Unfortunately, we don't have time to explore this now. Child Protective Services will arrive in approximately 20 minutes. I suggest you facilitate the process, Theodore. For Gabriel's sake, for Matthew's sake, don't make this transition traumatic. For him, again. I'm not going with you, affirmed Gabriel, his voice trembling slightly despite the determination in his gaze. Not this time. Something in Beatrice's posture changed subtly, a tension that wasn't there before. You don't have a choice, dear. You never had. Now I do. The boy looked at Theodore, and in that look was a mixture of plea and resolution. He will protect. My father always wanted to protect me. The word father hit Theodore like an electric current. Regardless of the bizarre science behind it all, the genetic manipulations and fragmented memories, that was the simplest and most powerful truth. That boy was in some inexplicable way his son, and he had failed to protect him once. He would not fail again. Martha, called Theodore without taking his eyes off Beatrice, take Gabriel to the car now. This is kidnapping, Theodore, warned Beatrice, her voice now laden with threat. You have no idea of the forces against which you're turning. Call it what you want, he replied, as Martha hurried to take Gabriel out. But remember that, unlike you, I have nothing to lose. You took everything from me 30 years ago. When Martha and Gabriel left, Ferguson strategically positioned himself near the door, blocking any attempt by Beatrice to follow them. Your actions have consequences, Theodore, said Beatrice, her face now a mask of contained fury. Consequences that will affect not only you, but everyone around you. You already threatened me with the worst possible 30 years ago, Beatrice. Theodore looked at the former detective. Ferguson, make sure our guest remains comfortably here for, say, an hour. It will be a pleasure, replied the investigator, crossing his arms with determination. Beatrice laughed, a sound devoid of any joy. You really think you can run away with him? We have global resources, Theodore. Influence at all levels of power. We will find you no matter where you hide. Perhaps, conceded Theodore, already heading to the door, but for the first time in 30 years, you're not in absolute control of the situation. And that, Beatrice, must be absolutely terrifying for someone like you. Without waiting for a response, Theodore quickly left, going down to the garage, where Martha was already waiting with Gabriel in the armored SUV. "Where are we going?" asked Martha, starting the engine as soon as Theodore entered the vehicle. "LaGuardia Airport. I have a private jet ready for immediate takeoff." He turned to Gabriel in the back seat. "Are you okay?" The boy nodded silently, his eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and determination. "She will find us," he said finally. "She always does." "Not this time," promised Theodore, with a conviction that he didn't know exactly where it came from. "This time we're breaking the cycle." As the vehicle serpentined through New York City's chaotic traffic, Theodore made quick and objective calls, mobilizing resources and activating emergency protocols he had established years ago for extreme situations. Not even his closest collaborators knew all his contingency plans, a habit of precaution that now proved vital. "Martha, I need you to do something for me when you drop us off at the airport," he said, after finishing the last call. "Go to the Central Bank and access private vault number 237. The password is Matthew's date of birth. Inside, you'll find documents, storage devices, and detailed instructions. Follow them exactly as described." "What are these documents?" she asked, skillfully maneuvering between cars. "Evidence about everything. My business, my competitors, politicians." Theodore paused. "It's my life insurance, so to speak. And now our only leverage against the people Beatrice mentioned." Gabriel was watching the city pass by the window, his gaze distant, as if seeing beyond the buildings and movement. "I'm remembering more things," he said suddenly, "about important people visiting the laboratory, about conversations regarding the next stage." He turned to Theodore. "They don't just want to take me back. They want to take the next step." "What step?" questioned Theodore, a new fear forming in his chest. "Replication." The word came from the boy's lips like a sentence. "They want to make more like me, many more." At that moment, as the car traversed the congested streets toward the airport, Theodore understood that he wasn't just fighting to save his rediscovered son. He was at the center of a conspiracy that could change the very concept of humanity. And the only way to protect Gabriel, to protect Matthew, was to expose everything, no matter who was hit in the process. "What happens when we reach the airport?" asked Gabriel, his voice momentarily returning to the childish fragility that matched his appearance. Theodore extended his hand and held the boy's, feeling the strangeness and familiarity of that contact simultaneously. "We're going to a place where they won't be able to find us easily, a place where we'll have time to gather allies and evidence." Theodore gently squeezed the boy's hand. "A place where you'll be able to decide your own destiny for the first time." Gabriel's gaze met Theodore's, and in it was a vulnerability mixed with something that seemed like hope. She said, "I'm just an experiment, that I'm not really human, not completely." "She is wrong," replied Theodore firmly. "You feel, think, dream. You have fears and desires. What could be more human than that?" When they arrived at the airport, the private jet was already prepared on the runway with engines running. The pilot, a former military man of trust who had worked exclusively for Theodore for more than 15 years, asked no questions about the sudden departure or the unusual destination. Martha said goodbye quickly, promising to follow the instructions and make contact through the secure channels established by Theodore. As the aircraft taxied for takeoff, Gabriel looked out the window, his eyes recording every detail as if he wanted to engrave that image forever. "This isn't the first time we've tried to escape," he said suddenly. "In the 5th cycle we tried, too." Theodore, who was checking some messages on his cell phone before turning it off completely, looked at the boy with renewed interest. "What happened?" "They found us in Lisbon." Gabriel continued, looking out the window, his voice strangely distant. "You weren't there that time. It was another man, a scientist who regretted what he was doing. He said he wanted to save me, said I wasn't an experiment but a person. The boy turned to Theodore, his eyes moist. They took him. I never saw him again. The gravity of the memories that Gabriel carried was overwhelming. Memories of lives that shouldn't be his, of traumas that no child should know. This time will be different, promised Theodore, although he knew they would face powerful and relentless adversaries. As the jet gained altitude, leaving New York City behind, Theodore knew that his life as he knew it was over. The company he built, his fortune, his social position, all would be sacrificed in the battle ahead. But for the first time in 3 decades, he felt he was fighting for something that really mattered. And this time, he wasn't alone. The small village in northern Portugal, nestled between verdant mountains and the Atlantic Ocean, seemed frozen in time. Stone houses with terracotta roofs dotted the landscape, and life followed a tranquil rhythm, distant from the agitation of large urban centers. It was the type of place where strangers were immediately noticed, but also where discretion was, valued as part of the local culture. 3 weeks had passed since the dramatic escape from New York City. Theodore and Gabriel were installed in a stone house at the edge of the village, officially rented by a Canadian couple who never appeared. The property belonged to Bruno Mendes, a Portuguese man who had worked for Theodore early in his career, and who now helped with the logistics of his hideout. That morning, while watching Gabriel playing with the dog they had adopted, a friendly mutt found wandering the village streets, Theodore reflected on how their lives had changed drastically. The boy seemed more relaxed, as if the removal from imminent danger had allowed his true personality to begin emerging. There were still moments of confusion, fragments of memories that didn't fit into the normal chronology of a human life, but there was also laughter, curiosity, and a childish enthusiasm that Theodore suspected had been suppressed during the cycles of experiments. The sound of an approaching car interrupted his thoughts. Bruno had departed the previous morning to pick up Ferguson at Porto Airport, and the return of the two meant that the next phase of the plan was about to begin. Ferguson looked exhausted when he stepped out of the vehicle, the marks of weeks of intense work evident on his face. But there was also a renewed energy in his movements, the kind of vigor that comes with significant discoveries. "How is he?" was Ferguson's first question as he observed Gabriel playing in the distance. "Better." "More stable," replied Theodore. "The nightmares are less frequent. And you, what did you discover?" The investigator cast a significant look at Bruno, who understood the message and moved away to give them privacy. "I think we'd better talk inside," suggested Ferguson, indicating the house with a discreet gesture. In the improvised office, where Theodore had set up an almost military operation to monitor his enemy's movements, Ferguson opened his suitcase and spread several documents on the table. "I managed to access some of the Aurora Institute's files, thanks to the contacts you indicated." He separated some photographs and reports. "It's worse than we imagined, Theodore. The Phoenix Project, as they call it, isn't just focused on rejuvenation. It's an attempt to completely redesign the concept of human life." Theodore examined the documents with growing horror. There were records of multiple test subjects, children like Gabriel, subjected to rejuvenation cycles. Most had failed, a clinical euphemism for fatal results. Gabriel, Matthew, coded as Subject G, was apparently the only case of consistent success. "My God, how many children?" "Most weren't really children, at least not originally," clarified Ferguson. "They were adults, initially volunteers, attracted by the promise of eternal youth. When the experiment started to fail, ethics were gradually abandoned." Theodore felt a wave of nausea as he contemplated the magnitude of the scientific perversion that Beatrice had helped create. "And what about the funding? Were you able to track it?" "Partially." Ferguson picked up another set of documents. "The New Horizon Foundation is just the visible facade. Behind it, there's a complex network of shell companies and hidden investors. I managed to identify some: 2 tech billionaires, a European pharmaceutical conglomerate, and at least 3 high-ranking politicians from different countries, including the Secretary of Science and Technology of the United States," completed Theodore recognizing a particular name on the list. Arnold Burroughs. He was one of the main supporters of my company in the early years, and curiously, he was the one who signed the authorization for the New Tomorrow Institute to operate in the United States without standard inspections, added Ferguson. Everything connects. While processing this information, Theodore noticed a separate envelope that Ferguson had not yet mentioned. And this? The investigator hesitated, his countenance assuming an even graver expression. This came from a different source, one you won't like. Intrigued, Theodore opened the envelope and found a series of detailed medical documents, some dated 30 years ago. They were the original records of Matthew's diagnosis, the neurological disease that Beatrice had mentioned. But attached to them, there was a handwritten note with a handwriting he immediately recognized. Not everything I told you was a lie. Some ends justify the means, but now the ends have changed. Aurora is no longer about saving lives, but controlling them. Look for D13 in the basement. The complete truth is there. B. Theodore looked at Ferguson, confused. This came from Beatrice? How? Martha found her waiting in your apartment in New York, 2 days after you fled. According to her, Beatrice seemed different, shaken. Ferguson sat down, passing his hand over his tired face. She delivered these documents and asked for them to reach you, said she had awakened to reality when she realized Gabriel was recovering memories that should be permanently blocked. The idea that Beatrice might be regretful or at least reconsidering her actions was difficult to accept after all they had discovered. It could be a trap, pondered Theodore, a way to lure us back. That's what I thought initially. But I verified the medical documents. They're authentic, Theodore. Ferguson pointed to the exams. Matthew really had a terminal condition. And there's more. I found the doctor who made the original diagnosis. He confirmed everything, including that Beatrice sought second, third opinions, experimental treatments, anything to save the boy. This information forced Theodore to reconsider the narrative he had built. The idea that Beatrice could have started her dark journey from maternal desperation, from a genuine desire to save her son, added a layer of moral complexity to the situation. And what about this mention of D13, he asked, returning to the enigmatic note. Martha is investigating. We believe it's a reference to a specific level of the Aurora Institute facility in Switzerland, possibly where they keep the most sensitive data, or something worse. The sound of light footsteps interrupted the conversation. Gabriel was standing at the door, observing them with a disturbing intensity. She's afraid, said the boy, surprising. Both men. Who's afraid, Gabriel? Asked Theodore softly. Her, the woman in white. Gabriel entered the office, his eyes fixed on the scattered documents. Because they took control, the men of the shadows. Ferguson and Theodore exchanged concerned looks. The boy's words seemed to confirm Beatrice's insinuation that the project had changed direction, possibly being taken over by forces with even more sinister objectives. Gabriel, do you know who these men of the shadows are? Asked Ferguson, with the care of someone interrogating a fragile witness. The boy furrowed his brow, as if trying to organize fragmented memories. They don't show their faces. They only observe from behind the glass, but one of them, his expression changed to something close to fear. One of them has a voice that makes the ground tremble. He says I'm the key to the future, that my DNA is special because it survived. Survived what, Gabriel? Insisted Theodore gently. The process, the cycles. Gabriel unconsciously touched the scar on his arm. Most don't survive, they disappear. But I keep coming back. She says it's because I have a strong emotional anchor, something to hold on to. The revelation was both moving and disturbing. The idea that Matthew's emotional memory of his father, of Theodore, could have been what kept him psychologically intact through the rejuvenation cycles was a double-edged sword. It validated the bond between them, but also underscored the horror of what had been done to the boy. Before the conversation could continue, Theodore's satellite phone, the only form of communication he allowed in the hideout, rang. It was Martha, and her urgent tone sent chills down Theodore's spine. They found Ferguson at the airport, she reported, without preamble. He managed to escape, but now they know he's in Portugal. It's a matter of time until they track you. How much time do we have? Asked Theodore, already mentally calculating the next steps. Days, maybe hours. Martha's voice was tense. But there's more. I gained access to the D13 sector that Beatrice mentioned. Theodore, there are more children there. 6 of them, all. In some stage of the rejuvenation process. And there are plans to expand the operation globally, using fertility clinics as a facade. The scale of the conspiracy was revealing itself to be even bigger and more disturbing than they had initially imagined. And Beatrice? Where is she? Disappeared, replied Martha. After our meeting, she returned to the institute in Switzerland, but never officially arrived there. Richard and Helen are coordinating searches, claiming she suffered a mental breakdown and represents a risk to the project's security. They silenced her, Ferguson concluded somberly. Or she's hiding like us, suggested Theodore, still not ready to completely dismiss the possibility that his ex-wife might have truly seen the error of her ways. Gabriel, who had remained silent during the call, approached Theodore with surprising determination on his young face. We need to save the other children, he declared. They're suffering, I can feel it. The statement was strange, as if Gabriel possessed some kind of connection with the other experiment subjects, another piece of the puzzle that Theodore didn't fully understand. It's too dangerous, he replied, placing his hand on the boy's shoulder. We need to keep you safe first. No, you don't understand. Gabriel's voice acquired an unusual urgency. It's not just about saving us. It's about stopping what comes next, the next stage. What next stage, Gabriel? Asked Ferguson, approaching. Complete. Transfer. The boy touched his own forehead. Not just rejuvenating the body, but transferring one person's mind to another. They want to build perfect bodies and then inhabit them. The implication was horrifying. A world where the powerful and privileged could essentially steal others' bodies, achieving a perverse form of immortality. My God, murmured Theodore. The magnitude of the threat finally clear in all its extent. That's why he's so interested in me and my DNA, continued Gabriel, because I'm proof that the body can be restarted while maintaining parts of the original memory. I'm the bridge to the next stage. Who is he, Gabriel? Asked Theodore, feeling they were finally reaching the core of the conspiracy. The boy hesitated, a tremor coursing through his small body. His name is Michael Volkov, a Russian billionaire. She calls him the architect. It was his idea to expand the project beyond rejuvenation, to complete transfer. Ferguson quickly typed something on his tablet. Michael Volkov, 87 years old, founder of Volkov Pharmaceuticals, diagnosed with a degenerative disease 5 years ago, rarely seen in public since then. He showed a photo of an elderly man with a severe appearance, penetrating eyes, and an authoritative posture even in his advanced age. He's dying, concluded Theodore, and he sees the project as his only chance to survive. Not just survive, corrected Gabriel, his eyes reflecting knowledge too dark for his apparent age. He wants to be born again, in a young and healthy body, a body like mine. The silence that followed was loaded with the weight of understanding. They weren't just fighting against morally compromised scientists or greedy businessmen. They were facing a man with practically unlimited resources, driven by the primal fear of death and unscrupulous about the means to avoid it. We need help, concluded Theodore, returning to the phone. Martha, contact the journalists on the contingency list. It's time to use the evidence from the vault. Are you sure? Martha's voice revealed understanding of the gravity of that decision. Once we release this information, we'll have no turning back, I know. Theodore looked at Gabriel, who was observing everything with a mixture of fear and hope. But this was never just about us, was it? It's about all those children, about the future. As Theodore finalized the instructions for Martha, Ferguson approached the window, watching the sunset over the Portuguese mountains. They must already be on their way, he commented. We need to move again, and quickly. No, said Theodore with a determination that surprised both Ferguson and himself. I'm tired of running. It's time to counterattack. What do you have in mind? Asked the investigator, intrigued by the change in approach. Theodore looked at the scattered documents, at the phone in his hand, and finally at Gabriel, this lost and recovered son through circumstances that defied normal understanding. A trap, he replied simply. We'll use what they most desire to lure them to where we want. They want me, concluded Gabriel, his voice small but firm. You want to use me as bait. Theodore knelt to be at the boy's eye level. I would never do that without your consent, Gabriel, and I would never allow them to take you again. He hesitated, searching for the right words. But if we work together, maybe we can end this once and for all, for you and for the other children. Gabriel studied Theodore's face for a long moment, as if seeking something beyond the words. Finally, he nodded. Let's do this. His voice acquired a surprisingly mature quality. Let's break the cycle. As the sun disappeared on the horizon, casting long shadows over the small Portuguese village, three figures began to plan a counter-offensive against one of the most powerful and secret organizations in the world. A disgraced financial magnate, a stubborn investigator, and a boy whose very body was the battlefield of a war over humanity's future. It was an unlikely alliance, forged by extraordinary circumstances. But as they worked through the night, refining every detail of the plan, one thing became clear. Their true strength came not from Theodore's financial resources, nor from Ferguson's investigative experience, but from the restored bond between a father and son who refused to be separated. Again. And perhaps, just perhaps, that would be enough to face what was coming next. The Santana Clinic, located on the outskirts of Geneva, was officially known as a treatment center for rare neurological diseases. Its elegant and discreet architecture, surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens and dense forests, projected an image of tranquility and exclusivity. Few knew that 8 floors below the surface, the true heart of the institution was hidden, the Aurora Institute. On that cold autumn morning, a middle-aged man in a wheelchair was being led through the main entrance by a nurse with a serious countenance. The man, apparently frail, had his face partially hidden by an oxygen mask and wore clothes of expensive fabric, though discreet. Mr. Volkov is waiting in the main laboratory, informed the receptionist after checking the credentials presented by the nurse. Dr. Miller, it's a pleasure to welcome you back. The man in the wheelchair responded with a weak nod, while the nurse led him to the private elevator that gave access to the lower levels of the facility. Inside the elevator, away from cameras and curious ears, Theodore Morgan removed the oxygen mask and exchanged a significant look with Martha, who was interpreting the role of the nurse. It worked, she whispered, visibly relieved. The fake credentials passed through security. Now comes the hardest part, replied Theodore, adjusting the hidden devices in his clothes. Tiny cameras and recorders, provided by one of the journalists from Theodore's trusted network, would document everything they found in the next few minutes. The plan had been meticulously elaborated over 2 tense weeks. After Gabriel's revelation about Michael Volkov being the true architect behind the Phoenix project, Theodore and his improvised team discovered a breach in the Institute's security system. Dr. Emmanuel Miller, a Brazilian neuroscientist who occasionally consulted for the project, was scheduled to visit the facility that day. A fake call redirecting his taxi and a brief detention for problems with his visa, courtesy of one of Ferguson's contacts in the Swiss authorities, had created the perfect opportunity for Theodore to assume his identity. Remember, we have at most 45 minutes before the security system registers the biometric discrepancies, warned Martha. The elevator stopped at the 5th basement, but instead of exiting, Martha entered a special code on the panel, making it continue descending. D13, murmured Theodore, remembering the clue left by Beatrice. The doors opened to a sterile corridor, illuminated by white lights that cast no shadows. The contrast with the elegant decoration of the upper floors was striking. Here there was no pretense of comfort or hospitality. It was a purely scientific environment, clinical in its efficiency. A woman in a white lab coat was waiting for them, her face a mask of professional efficiency. Dr. Miller, we were expecting your arrival. Mr. Volkov requests your presence immediately in the primary laboratory. She looked at Martha with slight suspicion. "Your assistant can wait in the observation room. I prefer to keep her with..." "Me," replied Theodore, mimicking the Portuguese accent he had extensively practiced. "She is familiar with my episodes." The woman hesitated, but finally nodded. "As you prefer. This way, please." As they were led through the aseptically white corridors, Theodore observed everything with disguised attention. Through glass doors, he glimpsed advanced laboratories where scientists worked on equipment that seemed straight out of science fiction movies. In one of them, he noticed what appeared to be a suspension tank containing a humanoid form connected to multiple tubes and sensors. After some turns and security doors that required the identification of the scientist guiding them, they finally arrived at the primary laboratory, a circular and spacious room dominated by 6 cryogenic capsules arranged in a star format around a central console. Each capsule contained what appeared to be a sleeping child, connected to a complex network of tubes and monitors. And at the center of the room, observing one of the monitors with intensity, was he, Michael Volkov. Even at his advanced age, the Russian billionaire emanated an intimidating presence. Tall and still maintaining an impressively erect posture for someone his age, his penetrating blue eyes contrasted with his pale skin and perfectly combed white hair. "Dr. Miller, finally," greeted Volkov, his English laden with a strong Russian accent. "We are about to initiate the final preparation phase for Subject G7. Your expertise will be valuable." Theodore nodded, keeping his head slightly lowered to hinder facial recognition. "It's an honor to participate in this historic moment, Mr. Volkov," he replied, discreetly observing the children in the capsules. Were those the other victims Gabriel had mentioned? "As you can see, the preparations for the transfer are almost complete." Volkov gestured to the monitors displaying complex genetic sequences. "The receiving body is ready. The final breakthrough that your Brazilian colleague Dr. Mendes provided with his neural mapping technique was the missing element." Theodore felt a chill run down his spine. The words confirmed Gabriel's worst fears. They really were planning to transfer Volkov's consciousness to a young body, possibly that of a child prepared specifically for this purpose. "Fascinating," he commented, approaching the screens to gain time while the hidden cameras documented everything. "And what about the procedure itself? Has it been tested?" "Simulations only. You will be the first to witness the real application." Volkov smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his cold eyes. "But first, we need to recover our main asset. G7 possesses the ideal genetic characteristics we need for the process. Fortunately, our agents have located him and his kidnapper." Theodore's heart raced, but he maintained a neutral expression with superhuman effort. "I understand there were complications with the recovery of this subject," he commented, trying to obtain more information. Volkov made a dismissive gesture. "Nothing that can't be resolved. The American businessman thought he could challenge us. A monumental miscalculation." He consulted his wristwatch. "At this exact moment, our recovery team should be arriving at the location in Portugal. Within 24 hours, G7 will be back in this laboratory." Theodore exchanged a quick and imperceptible look with Martha. This information was crucial. Volkov's men were attacking an empty location. Gabriel was safe on another continent, protected by Ferguson and a small team of hired security guards. The misinformation trap had worked. "And what about Dr. Morgan?" ventured Theodore, curious about Beatrice's fate. "I heard rumors that she expressed reservations about the new directions of the project." A dangerous gleam appeared in Volkov's eyes. Beatrice served the project well for decades. Her dedication to her son was productive, but lately she began to develop inconvenient scruples. He paused, studying Dr. Miller's reaction. "She's resting in one of our facilities in Eastern Europe until the project is completed." The way Volkov pronounced resting made it clear that Beatrice was being held against her will, possibly under heavy sedation or something worse. Despite everything Beatrice had done, Theodore felt a pang of concern. She had initiated all this out of maternal desperation, even if her methods were morally reprehensible. And her note, her warning, suggested she had finally perceived the monster she had helped create. "I understand," replied Theodore, adjusting the fake glasses that complemented his disguise. "And the timeline for the transfer?" "As soon as G7 is here, we'll begin the final preparations." Volkov approached one of the capsules, observing the sleeping child with a disturbingly possessive look. "This body was prepared as a backup, but it doesn't possess the genetic stability of G7. Multiple rejuvenation created unique characteristics in his DNA that make him ideal for the first complete transfer." Theodore felt his stomach turn upon realizing that Volkov referred to the children as mere bodies, receptacles for his consciousness. The level of dehumanization was absolute. "Impressive," he commented, moving strategically to capture more details with the hidden cameras. "And what about the ethical aspects that Dr. Morgan mentioned in her previous reports?" Volkov laughed, a sound devoid of any joy. "Ethics? Humanity has always been trapped in antiquated concepts that limit its true potential. What we're doing here transcends conventional ethics." His eyes shone with almost religious fervor. "We are redefining the very concept of human life. Imagine a world where death is merely a temporary inconvenience, where brilliant minds can continue their work for centuries in constantly renewed bodies. A world where only the privileged would have access to this technology," observed Theodore, unable to completely contain himself. Volkov studied him for a moment, a slight frown indicating suspicion. "Naturally. Like all innovation, it begins as a privilege for a few and eventually—" He interrupted himself, observing Theodore's face more carefully. "You seem familiar to me, Dr. Miller. Have we met before?" Theodore's heart accelerated, but years of negotiating under pressure allowed him to maintain his composure. "I participated in a symposium in Zurich a few years ago. You were the main speaker." The explanation seemed to momentarily satisfy the billionaire, but his gaze remained evaluative. Theodore knew his time was running out. "I would like to examine G7's most recent biometric data," he requested, trying to gain access to more information while he still could, "to familiarize myself with his particularities before reintegration." "Certainly." Volkov gestured to one of the scientists present. "Dr. Suarez, please show Dr. Miller the complete files of subject G7. The woman led Theodore to a nearby terminal, while Martha remained strategically positioned to observe the entire room. On the monitors, images and data of Gabriel Matthew, over decades of experimentation, revealed the true horror of what had been done. Videos showed the boy at different ages, always in the same apparent age range, but with subtly different expressions and behaviors in each cycle. One file in particular caught Theodore's attention: residual memory anchoring phenomenon. Upon opening it, he found detailed analyses of how certain elements of Matthew's memory persisted through the rejuvenation cycles, resisting attempts at selective erasure. Specifically, intense emotional memories related to father figure and family home presented anomalous persistence. "Fascinating, isn't it?" commented Volkov, who had silently approached. "The human brain desperately clings to certain emotional connections, even when the body is completely regenerated and explicit memory is erased. That's why we need subjects with intense emotional experiences for the next stage. Complete transfer requires a receiving brain conditioned to form deep bonds." The implication was clear and horrifying. They hadn't chosen Gabriel only for his genetic stability, but also for his demonstrated ability to maintain emotional connections through multiple rejuvenation cycles. It was this capacity that made his brain the ideal candidate to receive Volkov's consciousness. At that moment, a discreet alarm sounded on Volkov's tablet. He consulted the screen, his face instantly hardening. Interesting, it seems there was a problem in the recovery operation in Portugal. His penetrating eyes fixed on Theodore. The location was empty. Someone warned them. The air in the room suddenly became tense. Theodore knew his cover was about to collapse. "Perhaps the boy was moved previously," he suggested, keeping his voice calm despite the growing danger. "Perhaps." Volkov made an almost imperceptible gesture, and two security guards that Theodore hadn't noticed before discreetly approached. "Or perhaps we have an imposter among us." Everything happened very quickly. Martha, perceiving the situation, knocked over a cart of equipment, creating a momentary distraction, Theodore took advantage of the chaos to press a hidden button on his watch, the signal for the second phase of the plan. Seconds later, the laboratory lights flickered and went out, leaving only emergency lighting. An automated voice announced, "Security breach detected. Isolation protocol initiated." "What's happening?" demanded Volkov, his voice sharp as a blade. "Someone has invaded our systems," replied one of the scientists, frantically typing at her. "Terminal. All data is being copied and sent to external servers." It was exactly what Theodore had planned. While he distracted Volkov and his team with his presence, hackers hired by Ferguson were remotely invading the Institute's systems, using the access that Dr. Miller's stolen credentials provided. The entire truth about the Phoenix Project, the inhuman experiments, the children kept in capsules, the consciousness transfer plans, was being exposed to the world in real time. "Stop him," ordered Volkov, pointing at Theodore as understanding and fury took hold of his countenance. The security guards advanced, but Martha was prepared. With the precision of someone with military training that Theodore didn't know she possessed, she neutralized one of the men with a quick movement, while Theodore, abandoning the wheelchair, dodged the other. "You don't understand what you've done, Morgan," shouted Volkov, his face contorted with rage. "You just condemned humanity to continue dying like animals." "No, Volkov." Theodore tore off the wig and fake glasses while retreating toward the emergency exit they had identified in the facility's plans. "I just saved humanity from monsters like you." The chaos intensified when the ceiling sprinklers were activated, drenching the laboratory. Scientists ran trying to save data, while alarms sounded throughout the facility. On the main monitor now, a message flashed in red. "Transmission in progress. 78% complete." Theodore and Martha managed to reach the emergency exit, but Volkov, with surprising agility for his age, blocked their path. "You think this ends here?" The Russian billionaire laughed, a metallic and cold sound. "I have facilities on 3 continents. Even if you destroy everything here, the work will continue. The future I represent is inevitable." "Perhaps," conceded Theodore, "but it won't be your future. The authorities of 5 countries are receiving this information right now, along with detailed evidence of your crimes. Your empire is finished, Volkov." A rumble at the laboratory's main doors indicated the arrival of reinforcements, but not those expected by Volkov. Interpol agents, warned in advance by Ferguson, invaded the place with weapons drawn. "This is just the beginning, Morgan," hissed Volkov as he was handcuffed by 2 agents. "Humanity will eventually accept what we're offering. The promise of eternal life is too powerful to be ignored." "At what cost?" retorted Theodore. "Children transformed into guinea pigs? People reduced to receiving bodies? That's not the future we choose." As Theodore and Martha were escorted out of the facility, passing laboratories where doctors and scientists were being detained, he saw the children in the capsules being carefully attended to by emergency medical teams. Those innocent lives would now have a chance, just like Gabriel. Outside, Geneva's autumn sky was laden with clouds, but to Theodore it never seemed so clear. 3 months later, on an isolated beach in the northeastern United States, Theodore watched Gabriel playing in the sand with other children, the survivors rescued from the Aurora Institute. The recovery process would be long and complex for all of them, but the first signs were promising. Specialists in neurology and child psychology worked daily with the group, helping them process their fragmented experiences and build integrated identities despite the disconcerting memories of multiple lives. "He seems happier," commented Ferguson, approaching with 2 bottles of water, offering one to Theodore. "They all do," replied Theodore, accepting the drink. "It's amazing how resilient children can be, even after everything they've been through." The Phoenix Project scandal had shaken the world. After the operation in Geneva, similar facilities were discovered in Russia and Eastern Europe. Volkov and dozens of scientists and financiers faced charges in international court, while ethical debates about longevity research and genetic manipulation dominated academic and political forums. Morgan Investments, as expected, did not survive the storm. The company's association with Richard Albertson, one of the project's financiers through corporate embezzlement, was enough to destroy its reputation. Theodore had lost his fortune, but found something much more valuable. "We've received news about Beatrice," informed Ferguson after a moment of contemplative silence. "She was located at a facility in Romania, as Volkov insinuated. She's alive but fragile. The doctors say she suffered some kind of psychological collapse." Theodore nodded silently. His feelings toward his ex-wife were too complicated to be easily articulated. Anger, pity, and perhaps at some deep level, understanding of the desperation that had led her down that dark path. "Gabriel asked about her yesterday," he commented finally. "I think, despite everything, he still feels some connection." "And you? Will you allow him to see her when she recovers?" Theodore watched the waves breaking on the beach thoughtfully. "I don't know. That decision isn't just up to me. Gabriel may have the appearance of a child, but he carries experiences that few adults could understand." He smiled slightly. "We're learning to navigate this territory together day by day." At that moment, Gabriel ran up to them, his hair wet with seawater and a genuine smile illuminating his face. "Dad, come see what we found," he called, pulling Theodore's hand with childish enthusiasm. It was in these moments that Theodore clearly saw his son, not experiment G7, not the product of perverse science, but simply Matthew, the boy he had lost, and against all odds, found again. "I'm coming," he replied, allowing himself to be guided through the sand. As they walked toward the sea, Gabriel looked up, his eyes meeting Theodore's with surprising clarity. "You know, sometimes I still have confused memories. Fragments of other lives, other times." His voice was soft, almost getting lost in the sound of the waves. "But now I can differentiate them from the present. I can feel what's real." "And what is real for you, Gabriel?" asked Theodore gently. The boy smiled, squeezing his father's hand more tightly. "This here now." He looked at the horizon, where the sky met the sea in an infinite line. "Finally, I'm living my own story, not one someone wrote for me." That simple moment under the northeast sun, and with the smell of sea salt around, Theodore understood that they had really succeeded. The endless cycle of experimentation and control had been broken. Gabriel and the other rescued children would now have the chance that had been denied to them, the chance to simply be children, to grow naturally, to live their lives on their own terms. The future still held challenges, medical issues related to the long-term effects of the procedures the children had been subjected to, legal battles against the remnants of Volkov's network, and the continuous process of psychological healing. But for the first time in 30 years, Theodore looked to tomorrow not with despair or emptiness, but with genuine hope. As Gabriel ran back to his new friends, Theodore remained for a moment watching the horizon. In his pocket, his fingers unconsciously touched the small half-moon-shaped scar he had made on his own arm, a symbol of solidarity with Gabriel and the other children, but also a silent promise that some bonds are too strong to be broken, some truths too precious to be denied, and that the love between father and son can sometimes transcend even the darkest manipulations of science and fate. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that Theodore and Gabriel's journey has deeply touched your hearts. To continue experiencing exciting stories like this, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating narratives that explore the unbreakable bonds between parents and children. Find it here by clicking on the left side of the screen. If this story about second chances and redemption moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Daily, we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of human relationships and the mysteries of life. Share your emotions and reflections in the comments below. Your experience enriches our community of storytellers and listeners. Until our next meeting.